Welcome to Dare to Be Seen, brought to you by Alyssa Vulpes Productions and EDN Publishing. Join our host, Alyssa DiNapoli, aka Alyssa Vulpes, author, artist coach, hypnotherapist, singer-songwriter, and drummer, as she engages in down-to-earth, insightful, and inspiring conversations with female indie singer-songwriters around a virtual campfire. We shall discuss the lessons, songs, and personal stories of women who dare to be seen, scratching beneath the surface to give you an insider look into what makes their chosen career sometimes challenging and yet always inescapably compelling. So let's get the show started.
Welcome to another episode of Dare to Be Seen. I'm your host, Elisa Di Napoli, aka Elisa Vulpes, and today's episode features Ariel Wang. With many moods and meters, Ariel Wang's music pulls from a deep grounding in folk, with traces of metal, Western classical music, and progressive rock. Her songs trace a path of growth, lessons, traumas, triumphs, love, and heartbreak, cataloging experiences both unique yet universal. With a backing of talented musicians and as a multi-instrumentalist herself, Ariel Wang and her Wang Gang provide a kaleidoscopic musical experience that will tingle and excite the ears of any listeners. Before we meet our guest for today, I would like to invite you to go to tinyurl.com/poddiscount and you will be able to get 20% off my online course, Dare to Be Seen, where you will discover how to magnify your presence and command the stage in 10 easy steps so you can perform at your best in front of a larger audience. And now, here's our guest for today.
Community, there are people I've met who did not grow up as musicians but always had a desire for it, and my oldest violin student is, I believe, in her 60s or 70s. She's definitely retired, and she's been playing for, I believe, like 25 years, so she didn't start playing until she was in her 40s. If the music is not moving you, the audience can tell. Let go of branches miles above the stars. Let the thorns sink and tear the rivets on your guard. As the vines reach up towards the space between the sky and the soul, sings lullabies to those trapped in there. You are not in as vulnerable of a position as somebody else, then in a way, in order to make a better society and a better future, it is kind of up to you to step up. My head burns clear, 40,000 years on the hangman's tier. Being brave enough to advocate for someone, that's a kind of vulnerability, as well as like you're opening up and saying, hey, this is something I care about. Upon the sand.
So we've got Ariel Wang today on the show. I came across your music and I was quite impressed by how versatile you are. You seem to be able to do a lot of things. You are a teacher, a coach. You also are a multi-instrumentalist. You play lots of different instruments, and you also your music is quite kaleidoscopic. And it's basically, the way I understand it is it's quite folky, but then it's got this very interesting traces of Western Western classical music, prog rock, metal. So I guess, first of all, I wanted to ask you about how this love for music, how did it emerge in your life?
Yeah, so I started first on the piano at age 5. My mom is a piano teacher, so she was determined that I would play an instrument, and we quickly realized that having my mom teach me was not a good idea. So that didn't last very long. Um, but I remember when I was 8, my mom took me to see the Titanic, and my favorite scene of all time in that whole 3-hour long marathon is when Jack and Rose are in third class and they have this huge dance party with all of the musicians. And I remember after seeing that movie, I decided I was going to play the violin. And I predominantly wanted to learn folk music. And at first, my mom was a little bit reluctant because the piano lessons went so poorly. So she wasn't sure how committed I was, but I hammered her for a year, and finally they got me classical violin lessons. And as a kid, I resisted that. I didn't really want to learn classical music, but the more I learned about it, the more I fell in love with it. I think classical music is like a lot of different kinds of music, and I think what where there's a pretty big expanse of what classical music actually is. And I know a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't like classical music." And I felt like I was one of those people for a really long time. But just like any other genre of music, there's so much that you don't hear, in what's popular. And I think for a lot of people who don't like classical music, I highly, highly recommend actually going in and listening to different pieces and different composers and different instruments, because it's so different. And especially a lot of modern classical music, some of it sounds like if you listen to like Shostakovich or Kodai, these composers that are more within, I guess, the last 100 years instead of 300 years ago. A lot of it is very metal, a lot of it is very dissonant, and it's not like I think what a lot of people imagine when they think of classical music. And so I started falling more and more in love with it. And I always knew I wanted to be a musician. I started guitar and just really self taught on guitar when I was about 15. And I wasn't really writing music then. I was just learning things on my own. And I always knew I wanted to be a musician, but when I was younger, I think my parents sort of discouraged that path because they knew it was going to be really difficult, and they told me I had to get a college degree. Like whatever I did with my life, I had to get a college degree. So I stopped playing music and I stopped taking violin lessons. So I stopped taking violin lessons at 16, focused more on school. And then I actually stopped playing music for a really long time. And it wasn't until after school, after college, and I was a little bit uncertain where I wanted to go, I moved into a house of musicians. And I was surrounded by music. We had a basement where the my housemates had turned it into a music studio. People were having rehearsals, and it was really my housemates who encouraged me and pushed me to play music again. And I started playing guitar again. I started writing songs, and my first band that I had was actually just my housemates playing with me. And I would just be, and this happened a lot in this house. It wasn't even just with me, but with anybody in the house, somebody would start playing, and then one of the housemates would join in. And then next thing we're all just jamming and playing music together. And then when I was about 26, I decided I was going to just go fully into becoming a professional musician. So at that point, I hadn't played violin officially for 10 years, but I picked it up again. I went to grad school, got my master's in violin, and I've been basically a music teacher and professional musician, professional violinist since then. So I've had kind of a different path, I think, than a lot of musicians. I think a lot of musicians I know and play with, they start when they're really young and they never stop, and their families are very involved in their music playing sometimes. But it took me a lot of zigzags to get where I am here today. Yeah.
Wow, that's really fascinating because actually, funnily enough, I was talking about this today. With my boyfriend because I was thinking, I was telling him that a lot of the people that I have interviewed, they have some kind of musical background, maybe their grandma, their mother, their father, they went to school, music school from a very young age. And I was saying, well, I'm feeling a little bit envious because in my case, I didn't have that encouragement. I really wanted to play music when I was young, but my family, no one is a musician. They just wanted, they didn't think it was possible, and so it's really refreshing to hear someone who actually started later, and gives encouragement to other people that it's not too late, it's never too late. You can start again, even, if you haven't played music for 10 years.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that I've learned a lot about. I think I have a lot of insecurity around my music playing because I feel like I'm surrounded by these extraordinary musicians who've been playing their whole lives. But at the same time, I've also, through, I think, being just in the Bay Area and being around such a diverse community, there are people I've met who did not grow up as musicians, but always had a desire for it. And my oldest violin student is, I believe, in her 60s or 70s. She's definitely retired, and she's been playing for, I believe, like 20, 25 years. So she didn't start playing until she was in her 40s. So and she's made so much progress and she plays pretty advanced pieces. So if there's anything I've learned from my musical experience, and especially having had a community which supported me so much, like the first open mic that I played, which I thought personally was a complete disaster. Um, I played a cover of a song, and the first 3 rows were my housemates and my friends and that music community, like screaming and cheering for me as if I was the biggest band that has come in ages. Like, and I played one song pretty poorly, I would say, but the support really was what kept me going. And I think that anyone who wants to try music, if you're not around people who support you, like find someone who does, because it's never too late to play music. It is something that I think is of the life of the soul, and everyone has access to it. Like it's never too late.
Yes, that's a really a really inspiring message, and again, serendipity here is at play because just today I was reading a really good book called "The War of Art." I don't know if you've ever heard
Yes.
of it.
Yeah, I
Yes,
haven't read a whole lot
right.
of it, but yeah, I have it on my shelf.
Right. Well, I would really recommend it because even though there's some things I don't quite agree with at the end of it, but as a whole, it's a very good book. And one of the things it says is that, like you said, music is about feeding the soul, and that there's a there's always a bit of resistance that can happen, especially if you're blocked, but also, basically resistance is fear, fear that's too late, fear that you may not be good enough or whatever it may be, or fear that other people are not going to, applaud you or they might reject you. But he says, actually, what is recommended, it's much better to think of it as playing music for its own sake rather than playing music because of the approval that you may get. And I thought that's very true, because if you start thinking about it in terms of, how many likes am I getting, how many people are buying my album, well, you're gonna be disappointed, but also that's not what music is about,
Yeah.
you know?
I think it's very difficult for musicians, especially in the modern way that the music industry runs. It's difficult to find a balance between that, because I think if you want to be a professional musician, or if you even want anyone to hear your music, there is a level of having to learn about marketing and how to get your music out. But I think that you're right in that without the music coming from the soul and just your desire to make music first, it doesn't, it's not that, important how you market it if you don't have something that you feel connected to and that other people can connect to. I think an experience that a lot of musician friends of mine and I have felt is, and it's, I think especially in classical music, in that world where a lot of the times you're hired to play something, is if the music is not moving you, the audience can tell. And you have to, and especially if you're creating your own music, if you're not moved by your own music, or if it doesn't say something to you, the audience is not going to hear anything about from it either. And in my own experience writing music, the more I judge my own music, or the more I try to fit it into a box or get too technical with it, or it's the result is never as good as when I can just enjoy the experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I like every song that I write, or every piece of music I write ends up making it into the public ear. But if you're already not inspired by what you do, you're not going to get very far.
True, true. And also, I guess what this reminds me of is the ego versus the higher self. So, again, quoting that book, he's talking about he talks about a lot about God, and maybe even if you're not religious, you can think of that as your higher self or your unconscious mind. And he's saying, if you are writing music from the ego perspective, then you're seeking some kind of approval from other people. You're not going to go very far, and you're doing a disservice to the muse or the higher self or God, or however you want to understand it. And because in his view, the artist is more like a hollow reed, or a vessel for something higher, wherever it may come from, that flows through you. So it's not really about you, but you are the interpreter, if you like. I mean, would you agree with
Yeah,
that?
and I think it's a healthier perspective too, because I think that it's easy to, I mean, I think as people who are, we're social, right? Like we do seek approval from other people, and it's easy to get um what's the word? It's easy to get discouraged when you focus too much on, do people like this? Do people not like this? I mean, some of the most revolutionary music was disliked by a lot of people in its time, and I think that this idea of the muse, which I think is a very I could be totally wrong, but I think it's a very Greek way of thinking of it, that um that you are not the creator of the music, it's the muse that is the creator, and you are, like you said, the vessel. And I think it's a healthier way of thinking about it, because then it's not about you, and then there's also less pressure for you to be the center of everything, and having the music do well or not do well in a public or commercial way. There's less pressure because you can just say, well, my muse really didn't get out of bed this morning. They didn't give me anything today. And I think it is a healthier perspective, because you don't feel like yourself, your selfhood uh, is a reflection of the music. Self-worth is not based on,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, again, I don't know, I'm just quoting this book left, right, and center tonight, but I guess it's in my awareness. But it makes sense with what you're saying because, again, he's talking about the difference between amateurs and professionals. And he's saying if you're a professional, think about a job, that you have. Maybe it's not music, another job, a job that you do for money. Well, if you do a job for money, you're going to show up every day. You're going to do the work every day, whether you're in the mood or not in the mood, because you need to bring home the bacon, so to speak. So if you think of music in a professional kind of manner, then you do the work. You do the work every single day, whether you're in the mood or not in the mood, and you see it as work, and that can help you to distance yourself a little bit from it, because he's saying if you're an amateur, one of the problems you will have is that you will identify too much with your music, and then it's going to be very, very difficult, because then, like you say, if somebody doesn't like it, then you're going to take it personally. But actually it isn't personal. Maybe that person isn't ready for it. Maybe it's just, the equivalent of Van Gogh not being understood, during his his life. So, actually, just slightly on off topic, when you were talking about classical music, that's another thing I was thinking about recently, about how many people don't actually know a lot about classical music unless they're classical musicians. And but also the fact that I think, because there are so many different composers, and some are more rhythmical, some are more melodic based. um, is there anyone that, any specific composer that you would recommend for someone who doesn't know where to start in classical music at all?
Whew, that's a
It's
that
a
is a
difficult question.
difficult question. Um, Especially because I'm actually pretty terrible with names, and I'm
Okay, okay.
well, so some of the composers I mentioned before, like uh I would say like Shostakovich, Kodai, um and oh my god, see, bad with names. I'm even working on one of his pieces right now. There's another Russian composer in Shostakovich's time who Shostakovich actually despised. Prokofiev, there we go. Like their music I think is, especially if you like a lot of metal or heavier music, things that are very energetic, um and I think kind of just angsty. Their music is quite different from your Mozart and your Beethoven. I think people who like really technical music would really enjoy Bach. There's a lot of classical composers, so Nadia Boulanger is a woman composer who I really love. Her music is incredibly diverse. There's a lot of people know Robert Schumann as a composer, but I think I actually like his wife Clara Schumann's music better. So a lot of people know of Clara Schumann as a pianist. She was considered the best pianist in the world when she was alive, and she also did a lot of composing, and I think her music is absolutely beautiful and inspiring. And there's oh my god, there's just so many. Ravel is a composer, a French composer who I absolutely love, and he had a lot of jazz influence. And his music is, you can hear the jazz influence, but it's like someone took jazz and classical music and try and kind of put it together. So oh my god, yeah, it's endless. And there
What about in your music though? What is your an influence that comes through in your music?
ooh, that's mm, that's really hard to say, because I think for me there are pieces that I really love. I think if there's any composer that I think I'm really influenced by is Beethoven, who is one of the big greats that a lot of people know. But I think with Beethoven, love his music, and his music is like just the craftsmanship that goes into it. He was he had to work really hard with his music, comparatively to someone like Mozart, who was just a very natural talent. And so I think when you listen to Beethoven's music, you can hear how every little bit of it was like he spent a lot of time going over it and going over it and trying to pick what really goes in every place. And he thinks a lot about what he wants to bring out in the audience when he is creating his music. And I think a lot of the times his music doesn't always revolve around melody. It revolves around how the harmony takes people to different places. And I think with more and more with the music that I'm writing, um melody is still, I think, important. It's what a lot of people gravitate towards, but I've been thinking a lot more about the things that go underneath the melody, the harmony that creates a specific mood, and how picking certain chords beneath the melody can really change the expression of the melody. um and I think with Beethoven, he was just, like, and it sounds very egotistical to I think say this or think this way, but I think Beethoven was someone who really believed that his calling was music. And I think it sounds arrogant in a lot of ways, because, like, oh, you think, and he was, really influential, so of course, like, that says a lot. But I think there is something to be said about, like, feeling like, and I think this has a lot to do with just this idea of the muse. Like, it's like when I make music, I feel like there wasn't really anything else that I could really do with my life, and that's why I came to it. And that's not to say, I'm Beethoven, or I'm going to become the most, and it's like it almost like it has nothing to do with that. It's just there's nothing else that I can't imagine myself being compelled to do with my life, is making music, is making art. And I can relate to that sentiment that I think Beethoven expresses, although I think he took a much more egotistical stance about it. But I can really relate to that feeling. um,
Right. Yeah, you're following your calling, really, your heart and your calling.
yeah, yeah.
And you mention in your music that I mean in your bio you mentioned that there are specific messages that are close to your heart. You talk about growth, trauma, triumphs, love, heartbreak. So this is sounds like you have some specific topics that you're particularly passionate about. So what would you say is the message, if any, of your music, or a theme that runs through your music?
I think if there's any theme, it would be that of community, and really building good relationships with other people. And I think it doesn't necessarily come across directly in a lot of the music that I write. But I think just the importance of being vulnerable. And I say this as someone who has a lot of difficulty being vulnerable with other people. I find it really hard to talk about myself, and to get really deeper and talk about things that are, that are very close to me, that I think are just difficult things to talk about. But I think that it's a worthwhile pursuit to learn to be more vulnerable with other people. And I think making music is a very vulnerable thing to do, because you are expressing something either about your own emotions or about something that happened to your life, or you're trying to say something with your music. And I think that that's, yeah, if there's any theme, it's like that's how we build community and how we build good relationships with other people, is by being vulnerable and by opening yourself up to other people. And I think also by opening the door for other people to be open to you. And if we come from a stance of being vulnerable and opening up and asking other people to be honest and open and vulnerable with their feelings, that's the way we're going to build a better world. I think recently I have slightly more direct, I think, I would say, I guess maybe political is the right word for it. Although I feel like saying something is political is an instant way to turn a lot of people off. I think the songs that I write do address sort of the inequalities and things in our lives a little bit more directly than I have in the past. But I think even the songs that I write about loss, you know, those are to me still on the same veins, because I think expressing your own losses and your own fears and your own love opens up the door for other people to explore those feelings in themselves. And talking about something that's maybe a little bit more political, or talking about something that is a problem you see in society, I hope it becomes an opener for people to either explore it as a topic, whether they disagree or agree with it. And also I say, because I think art, I think what it does really well, and what I want to do with my art is point people to something, like by saying something with your music or expressing an emotion, you're saying, to the audience or whoever's listening, like, look at that, that is something I think we need to turn our eyes to and our hearts to. And if we can all turn our hearts to the same things and feel open to exploring those topics, I think that's how we're going to relate to each other and how we're going to build better communities and hopefully solve interpersonal or international problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like we were saying at the beginning of this interview, before we started recording, we were talking about, how sometimes it can be difficult to be in a world where we feel like we can't change it, we can't do very much. But I was saying to you, and I would repeat that now, that if you fully are aligned with your own heart's desire, and like you are, then you are fulfilling your mission. You are in alignment with your purpose, so to speak. What I mean with purpose is, the kind of meaning you give or create for yourself in your life. And so it sounds to me like you are through this calling, through pointing out in your own way, using the talents that you have, pointing to the social themes that are important to you, you are making a change. You are making a change in a way that is aligned with what you can do. And that's all we can do. We do a little bit, our little bit, and it may seem insignificant, but actually sometimes it can have quite big consequences. And also, you're talking about vulnerability, which is a topic dear to my heart. I don't know if you know Brené Brown.
Yes.
She talks about, being in the arena and being vulnerable with the people that have earned your trust, of course. And I can see how this is relating also to the way that a lot of people see vulnerability as weakness rather than a strength. But I would agree with you that it is definitely a strength to be able to be vulnerable. But also, I guess there is a little bit of a risk there too.
Yeah, and I think that, especially thinking about things like trauma, is something that I think for a lot of people is what ends up closing them to vulnerability, which makes a lot of sense. Like, trauma teaches us that you can get hurt, and you can sometimes get hurt really, really bad. Um, and it's it's hard. It's you know I think with thinking of Brene Brown, and when she talks about vulnerability, like, something I relate really a lot to her is she talks about being a person who talks about vulnerability who's also very bad at vulnerability. And I relate to that so much. And yeah, I think it's like anything, it's so complicated, because it's hard to ask a traumatized person or a traumatized group of people to be vulnerable. Um, and I think about, you know, what like, how do we create spaces where people can be vulnerable to each other? Especially, I think that it's really hard for people who need to be vulnerable to each other to build huge bridges. Um, those are the places that, in some ways, we need the most vulnerability, but we're also asking the most vulnerable people to put themselves in a lot of danger. Um, and and I think about, with, at least in the US, when you're talking about racial politics and just kind of a lot of the social things that are going on now. um like, I think it's a lot to ask people from more vulnerable populations to open up. And I think that's where things like allyship and learning how to be a good ally is so important. It's like, if you are not in as vulnerable of a position as somebody else, then, in a way, in order to make a better society and a better future, it is kind of up to you to step up, um, and try to be advocates for the people who have to suffer. And there's a lot of different things, like people who are able-bodied advocating for people who have to, you know, have disabilities that don't allow them to have the same privileges that able-bodied people have. He talks about, about race, and racism, and it could be, LGBTQ, like people who are not trans, having difficult conversations with people who are maybe transphobic, um, but having those conversations so it's not the trans people who always have to have the conversations. And it go and homeless population. I mean, there are so many vulnerable populations. And I think that, it's overwhelming to try to take it all in, but I think it's important, if you have some sort of privilege, that you don't have to bring up, you know, homelessness at every party. But it's, I think, if there are times when it feels right to advocate for someone. um Part of being vulnerable, I think, also is like, uh being brave enough to advocate for someone. That's a kind of vulnerability as well. It's like you're opening up and saying, hey, um this is something I care about, and I think we should have a conversation about it.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about this is that a lot of the time I've heard of people, who are privileged for whatever reason, whether it's a race thing or how much money they have or the place in society. And I've heard of these people feeling sometimes guilty. I've had some clients that have come to me thinking, oh, I'm just feel so guilty because I've got everything and I shouldn't be happy. And one of the things that I say to that is, well, okay, so you're privileged, but what is your guilt doing? Is your guilt doing any good to anyone? And what would be a better way to actually use the privilege that you have? Because it is a gift. You're lucky for whatever reason you have it. Maybe the best way to really appreciate it is to use it in like you say, in advocating for people who are not so lucky. And you were telling me that again at the beginning of this podcast before we started recording, that you have a podcast yourself, and it's actually about advocating for musicians that are people of color or people from the LGBT community. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And also, I'd be curious about knowing where your interest for this actually emerged in you. How did that come about?
Yeah. To answer your first part, the organization that my friend Margaret Jones and I co-founded is called Subrosa Sound, and we currently mostly have a podcast and also a radio show on an online radio station called Shady Pines Radio. And r- our main our main mission is to advocate and push forward the music by people of color, by women, by LGBTQ plus. And it's the way I like to describe it is mostly, right? Like I don't think that white men, which is really the demographic we don't mention and don't spend a lot of time with, I don't think they need to be excluded from the conversation. They're just not our main aim. So, we have bands that have white men in them. And I think that that's an important thing for me, at least, is that yes, there are vulnerable populations that need to be advocated for, but that doesn't equate with excluding someone from the conversation. And I think that that's a distinction that gets missed a lot in the back and forth of political debate. Is I think a lot of white men especially, but I think a lot of white people in the, at least in the issues around race, they feel like, oh, if we're talking about this, it means we're not allowed to have a say. And that's not really what I think anybody wants. I think what people want is to create more inclusion, not less. And when people point out that someone has been, whether it's about race or gender or economic inequality, people are not saying we want to put somebody else down. They're saying we should all be risen up. And Subrosa Sound, that's something that I really, I usually say it a little more like sarcastically or kind of as a throwaway, like mostly indie, mostly people of color, but really the reasoning for me behind that is like I want there to be space for everyone. And the only reason that we're focusing on these populations is just they haven't had the same opportunities. It's not because we don't like white men. I'm dating a white man and great. He's amazing. And, going back to my why I started playing the violin, if it weren't for him, and he is a professional cellist, and also composer and songwriter, and he has, I mean, his musical talents are extraordinary. But if it weren't for his encouragement and the fact that he was very open to showing me how he makes it as a professional musician, I would not be here. So I have a white man, honestly, to thank for supporting my musical ambitions. So I think that that's the thing that gets lost in the internet, social media, back and forth, is these nuances. So yeah, Subrosa Sound, our website is subrosasound.org, and we do a album of the week podcast, episodes where we talk about albums that we really like and that are coming out. And then we also have interviews with musicians. And on the radio show, that's Pacific time, Mondays, 8 to 10 p.m. on uh, on shadypinesradio.com. That's the online radio station we're on. Um, the Sub Rosa Sound radio show is Mondays, 8 to 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I play music by mostly people of color, LGBTQ plus women, mostly indie music as well. Although I will put on some of the more popular stuff sometimes, but it's mostly more indie musicians, and I also do interviews on that. So that's kind of what we do. And to your, I guess the second part of your question, the impetus to be an advocate and do these kinds of things, I think has been something very dear to me as far back as I can remember. I feel a calling to that. I don't know if it's as strong as music. I sometimes can't tell, but I think just this idea of trying to connect people and trying to help people build relationships, that's something that I've always wanted to do. I think in middle school, I was the total lame kid who, like, one of our assignments I remember in 7th grade was to prepare a speech, and it could be a speech about anything. And people were doing all these like really cool speeches about like really awesome musicians, or their favorite sports figures or teaching about like really cool food and all this stuff. And I went up and I was like not a popular kid. I was quiet, I was nerdy, and I did this whole speech about bullying and how bullying is a big problem in all levels of public and I'm sure private school, and how it's something that needs to be addressed. And I swear, like my entire class, except for one person, fell asleep during my speech, and it was not long. It was like 5 minutes, and I was like, well, I guess this is. I guess I don't think anybody heard me. But what was interesting about that, like when you say like, if you think too much about audience, then that's not, I think for music, for advocacy, for all of that, like, it becomes too self-centered. Is actually there was the one person who stayed awake came up to me a week later, and then again years later when we were in high school, and told me like, I still remember that speech you made, and it meant a lot to me, and it got me to really think about my actions. And he wasn't a bully, but he was like, I started thinking of the sort of interactions I see around me at school very differently. um and I think all of that is to say, I think what you were saying about privilege and guilt and things like that, it translates so much to other things, to music. Is like, I think any time when you become too focused on self, um it's that's when you can kind of lose your way, because you get distracted by guilt or likes or audiences or how many people fell asleep during your seventh grade speech. And it takes away from the message, and to what you feel called to do with whatever it is you feel.
Yeah. Yeah, and also another thing that this flows also with what you were saying before, because you were talking about not excluding white men and including basically everybody in the conversation. And I think in the political arena, at least at the moment, it seems to me that there's a lot of black and white and polarization and good versus bad, the baddies and the goodies. And it's very easy to just blame each other, and that's how wars start. And it's like, well, it may not be a very sexy subject to talk about inclusion, even to include the bully. Let's talk about the problem with the bully, rather than saying, well, you're a bully, you're a bad person, and you shouldn't be the way you are, out you go, because of course that's only going to create more problems. Now, it's difficult to talk about this sort of things. It's very difficult. It's much easier to say, well, that person's bad, let's just push them out, let's blame them. But at the end of the day, you're not really resolving anything, in that way. Whereas with the approach you are mentioning, okay, so a lot of people may fall asleep, but the one person that has listened, you may make a difference in their life. So actually, that's worth it, and it's worth to focus on that one person.
Yeah, and I think that it's a lot of the consequences of this kind of simplified conversation about inclusion and exclusion, and and who gets canceled and cancel culture. I think that the problem comes when people do not think deeply about these issues, and people don't research. And I think people also don't like to admit that sometimes they don't know what the right answer is, or they don't know everything about a certain situation. And a lot of what I'm alluding to is the idea of being able to differentiate, say, someone like Harvey Weinstein, who has been using his position to abuse women his entire career. And it was so well known that it was like, at least within the film and acting Hollywood community, like Harvey Weinstein was someone who's been known to be someone who abuses his position for a really long time. So the consequences for someone like him should be very different than, say, someone who's, say, in high school and says something really abusive or racist, or any number of horrible things as a teenager, and then rather than addressing it and having a deep conversation about it, they are no longer accepted to school. And I'm sure there are people that will disagree with me when I say, like, and I think there's a specific case I'm thinking of where a student said something really racist and inflammatory, and got caught, and then Harvard, I think he was accepted at Harvard, and then Harvard rescinded his acceptance. And while the merits of whether that was the right way to address it, honestly, I am not qualified to make that decision. But it, to me, begs the question of what happens next, because someone who's a high school graduate, um, is at a very different part of his life than someone like Harvey Weinstein, who has been, you know, abusing for decades. And the fear that I have around cancel culture is not so much a debate of whether canceling someone is right or wrong, but what comes after, or what are people really going to do about it? If somebody, say, loses their job because it comes out that they've sexually abused a few women, like, I don't know that making sure that they have zero income for the rest of their life is going to make a change. That's not to say it isn't the that it's wrong to say, okay, you've been abusing women, there has to be some consequence. But it's always the what comes after, because I think what happens with the internet is people, you know, get really passionate about something, and then to them, when someone finally gets fired, or when someone's college acceptance gets rescinded, or when someone goes to jail, that feels like a win, and then they go off and do their next thing. But I don't think those things really solve the problem, and I think it's the same thing with, at least America, the conversation around police brutality, um and especially police brutality in terms of people of color. I think it's really easy to say, "Oh, I marched in this protest," and you know, we got covered by news, and had these conversations, great, and then people drop off. But that's not really enough, and I think that I don't know what the answers are, but my fears around the way things are handled right now is it's so easy to say, okay, I did this thing, now it's done, now it's solved. But then there's never any real change that comes after.
It's easier to point the finger and blame and then just actually resolve the issue. And it's the difference between punitive justice and reparative justice, rehabilitation, trying to figure out what is actually happened in the first place. And actually reminds me a little bit, even though it's a different topic, but it reminds me a little bit of, when someone is, for example, addicted to drugs, and we think of this person as the problem, and, we need to punish this addiction, rather than actually understand where it stems from, where it comes from, what to do to make the situation better. In the long term, it might be a lot more difficult to make it better, but it is worth the effort, because if we don't, well, it's just going to happen again.
This is something I'm realizing more and more too, is that, you know, I think a lot of the things that we talk about within certain frameworks, whether it's, guilt around privilege, addiction, or how to create music, or how to, there's so many topics that I think are just elements of the human experience. And I think we forget that even though you're talking about a different thing, that they still reflect the same human experience. And that if we can learn to take whatever it is we do, and expand it to further our empathy to other things and other people, like I don't know, I think, yeah, a lot of the things that we talk about, I mean, even in this one conversation, the same themes apply in so many different places.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been really fascinating, and I could go on forever and ever. But I think we should show some of your music to our listeners. And so you were mentioning that you wanted to play a song for us called Carolina. Now, do you want to tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
it?
So this is a song that is one of my oldest songs that I've written, but I think it's still one of my favorites for sure. And it was a song that really came from the muse. It took like 30 minutes to write the whole song, all the words, everything. And it just all came at once. It was like someone just handed me a package and I just had to slowly open it and then read everything and then learn, like it definitely felt like I was learning a song rather than writing it. And it's my music has gone through a lot of phases. I think earlier on I really wrote about kind of just more emotions, and I like to sort of tell stories and kind of illustrate experiences through storytelling, and illustrate emotions and feelings through storytelling. um and now I'm like more in the I'm just going to tell you what I think about this one you know thing that happened. And yeah, I'd like to combine those two. But in any case, this song is it's very much about experience and emotion. Carolina, it's been so long. Roses have wilted and the leaves are long gone. Carolina, I've forgotten your voice. If I hear your harmony, would it drown out all this noise? Carolina, where have you been? My heart's been aching, and this old porch has worn thin. Carolina, do you hear me call? Skies are getting dark, and the leaves are ready to fall.
Beautiful. I love that. So sweet. Just a very sweet melody. Before I let you go, just wanted to let our listeners know that you also do a weekly live stream on your Facebook page. You've got videos weekly out, and you're working on an album as well. Our listeners can find all the links to your Facebook page on the show notes. But the last thing I want to just ask you before I let you go is just about your upcoming album. If you want to tell us when to expect it and what is it going to be about?
Yeah, it's the plan is for it to be out next year in September, which is a long ways away. But it's probably the biggest, most ambitious project that I've made so far because I want it to be sort of like creating a world, and it's going to be a double album. And one of the things that I think with the most recent album I came out with, which is called Bridges, is I really wanted to combine sort of the different sides of my musical life, the kind of more instrumental, classical composing side with the more songwriting and kind of folk. With some, metal and prog influence and a little, I felt like with the last album, I wanted to just put everything in it. And I wanted to take a different approach this time and actually really hone in on the two different sides, but then sort of present them together. So the plan is for it to be a double album of the same songs, but just kind of two completely different visions for the same songs and the same kind of basic elements. So I have huge plans for that. The idea is that I'm going to create two sides actually to my website for this album, where they're going to have visual representations that kind of go with each of those. And there's a lot of other things that I'm planning, which I'll be kind of releasing starting in the new year. I'm going to release singles, but there's all these other levels to this that are going to come out slowly, leading up until September, when everything is going to be finalized and come out in the final album and the final recordings. So all of that will be happening on my YouTube, my Facebook, Instagram, my website. I also have a Bandcamp, and I'm starting to learn about Twitch. So this is one of the things that I've really enjoyed about quarantine, is learning about all of these different platforms. And now I want to kind of use all of them to present something that is multifaceted, and that people can enter this album and this kind of sonic world through all these different elements.
Oh, that's fascinating. I can't wait to hear it. So, and people can find all of these links from your website. Is that correct?
Yes, website, Facebook, and there will be actually things that I'll be putting onto my website that say won't make it to social media, but then there will be things on social media that might not end up on the website. So yeah, I want to try to use each of these platforms in the way that I think they were made to be presented, and the way for people to interact with them. So I'm going to be kind of putting in all these different elements and choosing which platform to use based on how I think it'll really best be experienced. So yeah, website, Facebook, Instagram.
Wow, you're not only an artist, but you're also a tech whiz.
Not a tech whiz. This is I have friends. And this is, I mean, speaking of community, if it weren't for my friends who are much more technically inclined than I am, and also friends who have introduced me to like different like platforms that help you learn about this. Like, I mean, this is why community is so important. It's because no one person can do and understand everything. And that's why we all need each other.
On that note, thank you so much for being on the show, and all the best with your musical endeavors.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great. And you are wonderful. And I loved having this conversation with you.
Thank you. That was my guest, whom I'd like to thank once again for coming to the show. Every week, I'll be chatting to fantastic indie performers to uncover what it really takes to be a female, independent singer-songwriter in this day and age, and how we can support one another to keep shining our light onto the world through our creative endeavors. So make sure you don't miss out by subscribing to Dare to Be Seen and follow us on socials at tinyurl.com/daretobeseenpod.
That's all for this episode of Dare to Be Seen. Join the conversation on facebook.com/groups/Dare to Be Seen podcast and help create an empowering community of independent female singer-songwriters who support one another. For show notes, resources, and information on today's episode, visit tinyurl.com/daretobeseenpod. And remember to shine your own unique light onto the world. It needs it.